At the beginning of the 20th century, the Xinhai revolution toppled the Qing dynasty. The rebels had largely been led by son Yat-Sen, while Yuan Shikai led the Beiyang army, defending the dynasty. In the ensuing chaos, the Mongolians under the Bogda Khan broke free and declared independence, and so too did the Dalai Lama in Tibet. The chaos grew so bad inside the country because there had been a long history of creating independent military units which followed their commanders rather than any centralized government. So these commanders became the warlords, switched sides, formed alliances, and generally kept China divided for the next couple of decades. As both the rebels and the Qing dynasty failed to make any breakthroughs, they entered into negotiations. Yuan Shikai agreed to oust the child emperor Puyi in exchange for the revolutionaries laying down their arms. This should have brought democracy to China theoretically, but Yuan then made himself emperor, starting a whole new wave of rebellions and protests, like the National Protection War in the south. Even his own followers, Duan Qi and Zhu Xiqiang, resigned from their posts and began to create their own political factions. So Yuan resigned just before his death, and Li Yuanhong was made the new president. However, as things are about to get very complicated, I'll draw a line across China and discuss what happened separately. In the north, there were the remnants of the Qing dynasty, old allies of Yuan Shikai, and others who all vied for control of Beijing, while in the south, Sun Yat-sen Republicans and the likes fought for control of the reunification forces. So let's start in the north. The first warlord to really gain prominence and challenge for control was Duan, leader of the Anhui clique. His chief rivals besides President Li was Feng Guozhang, leader of the Jili clique. Both cliques were named after the provinces in which they had most support. But within the Jili clique, other prominent warlords would appear, like Wu Peifu and also Cao Kun, who earned the title the bribing president. And there was also Feng Yuxian, the Christian warlord, who would later go on to create his own clique, the Guominjun. Many of these men had prior military experience and used that to seize power. But some, like Zhang Duolin, was just a bandit who, with a little Japanese assistance, took control of Manchuria and formed the Fengtian clique. In fact, this became one of the most industrial regions in China thanks to foreign investment, and therefore, this bandit became one of the most powerful warlords. And again, within this clique, more future leaders would appear, like Zhang Zhongzhan, who was also called the Dogmeat General, and possibly the most cruel of the warlords, famous for splitting open prisoners' skulls with a sword, and also, weirdly, writing very bad poetry. Many of these people would constantly change sides, but some, like Yan Zishan, who ruled over Shaanxi, largely kept his province neutral, allowing it to develop somewhat. Then, in the west, the Muslim areas were divided between the Ma clique and the Xinjiang clique. In Gansu and Qinghai, the descendants of the loyalist Gansu braves formed the Ma clique, and under Ma Anliang, they remained part of China. While further west, Yang Zhengxin, an old Qing official, crushed rebellions and ruled over Xinjiang throughout most of the 20s. As for Inner Mongolia, that territory was often split between the Anhui clique, the Manchurians, the Ma clique and others. And I should say, don't take these maps as the ultimate truth. Sometimes warlords would swap within the same year, splinter and then realign. This is just a very simplified version. But first I should say this video is long and can get complicated. Yet if you're like me and prefer bite-sized information, thankfully there's Morning Brew. For years now I've wasted a bunch of time in the morning scrolling through Facebook, Instagram and the likes. But now, just in 5 minutes on Morning Brew, I learn something completely new and stay on top of the news of the day. That's because Morning Brew sends a free daily newsletter, Monday through Sunday, detailing all the business, finance and tech news. So for me, I've discovered how crypto is helping charities, and I've been particularly interested in the news that Moderna is suing Pfizer. And this news is presented in a witty, relevant and informative way, meaning even if a topic doesn't immediately spike your interest, you could well get hooked and delve deeper into something you may have skipped over in a newspaper, for instance. And again, this is a free newsletter. So if you're at all interested in business, finance or tech, maybe you want to keep on top of the stocks, for instance, or just learn something new, well then sign up at morningbrewdaily.com/jabzy, and within seconds you can get all of this news at your fingertips. But for now, let's get back to the warlord period of China. So these are just some of the most prominent warlords in the north. In the last episode, I discussed these following events in more detail, but as just a quick recap, initially Yuan held a lot of power, so President Li invited a general named Zhang Shun to help remove Yuan. This, however, was a disaster, as Zhang Shun was a monarchist and he marched on Beijing with the hopes of restoring the Qing monarchy. Li panicked and resigned, naming Fen Guozhang as the new president and Yuan as his premier. But as all of this was ongoing, Sun Yat-Sen had started the constitutional protection movement in the south, established a junta, and challenged the new government. However, I'll get onto the south later on. So in Beijing, to stop either clique from taking full control, Chiang was made the new president, but he had very little power. Yuan and his Anhui clique then decided to take loans from the Japanese to bolster their forces and fight against Sun Yat-sen's forces in the south. But this proved to be incredibly unpopular, as he promised them concessions in return, like the recognition of the Japanese takeover of the German colony in Shandong. This led to the May the 4th movement in China, which in turn helped to create the Communist Party. However, as these loans did help Yuan create his own army, he tried to gain credibility by reclaiming Mongolia. But this just worried an old ally of his, Guangzhou Lin, who didn't like having Yuan's forces so close to his border. So he decided to move against his old ally and formed an alliance with Cao Kun, the new leader of the Jili clique, and together they started the Jili-Anhui War in 1920. The Jili-Fengtian alliance received diplomatic support from the British and Americans, while the Japanese provided assistance to Yuan. During the war, Wu Peifu of the Jili clique successfully outflanked the Anhui forces, and Yuan was forced to resign. The whole war in fact just took 9 days, and now the Fengtian and Zili cliques split power in the capital. This, by the way, was the endgame of most of the cliques. Control over Beijing meant international recognition, and therefore an increase in trade and the likes. And this was vitally important because as the warlord era progressed, the number of fighting men in China went from 500,000 in 1916 to over 4 million by the late 1920s. Feeding and equipping such large armies was a challenge, as most of the regions were incredibly poor. Even the more industrialized province of Manchuria only generated $21 million a year, but spent double this on their army. Guangzhou Lin, like other leaders, were uneducated, and just decided to constantly print off money. But as you would expect, this just led to crippling inflation. However, as he misunderstood the situation, he would actually just shoot merchants for being greedy and raising their prices. Other warlords just taxed everything, and as goods had to pass through the territories of different warlords, food could be taxed close to 200%. This meant, especially in the interior of the country, food became even more expensive, and the ongoing famines became even worse. Nevertheless, the warlords would still live a lavish lifestyle in palaces, surrounded by foreign goods and dozens of servants. Then, just like in all previous decades in China, natural disasters would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands, like the Yuan earthquake, which killed 250,000 people. 500,000 people then died in the famine of 1920, and 6 million people died in famines in 1928. Add in the tens of thousands of deaths in smaller earthquakes, pandemics and the likes, and you had near constant natural disasters mixed in with the constant warfare. So in this environment, many turned to banditry, and even those who joined the armies of the warlords just continued to practice banditry anyway. Within nearly every province, some bandits and groups banded together to defend their community. Like around Hebei and Shandong, there was the Red Spear Society, and from 1920 to 1926, there were the Spirit Soldier Rebellions in Sichuan and Hebei. These peasants followed in a long tradition of uprisings in China, arming themselves with antiquated weapons, and believing potions and amulets could protect them from gunfire. They began to merge these magical beliefs with old religions, and one peasant leader even declared himself to be the Jade Emperor. Again, these groups popped up across the entire country, and this period is already complicated enough, so I won't go into too much detail about them. One group that will become relevant though is the Green Gang in Shanghai. This was a boomtown with large sections controlled by foreigners, and this secret society popped up to organize the criminal elements of the city. Shanghai at that time was often described as a sort of city of sin, so the Green Gang had ample opportunity to trade opium and engage in other criminal acts. Otherwise, to continue funding the wars, looting and kidnapping across the provinces was also commonplace. Many groups would even take women to be sold into sexual slavery in order to continue fighting. Then anyone caught going against the warlords, even those who went on strike or didn't hand over produce, were executed in some incredibly cruel ways, like being burnt, hacked to death, or even having their organs put on display. The soldiers who were actually committing all of these crimes were usually just in their teens. But this is really expected, as the average life expectancy in China was just 30 years old. To put this into some comparison, in Japan it was already 45 years old, and in Britain it was around 58. Plus, opium became even more prevalent, and it was a great source of income for the warlords, some of whom were addicted themselves. But this still was not enough to feed their armies, let alone their population. The armies were poorly equipped, 90% were illiterate, and the average height was just 4'6" or 1'37" m tall. So many turned to employing people from abroad, especially those fleeing the Bolsheviks over in Russia, and from all reports, a small number of foreign troops could wipe out entire units of the local, short, teenage, probably opium-addicted Chinese forces. Of course, I'm simplifying a lot here, but it's just to give you an idea of the absolute lawless state China had entered into, and had really been in for decades now. After all, banditry, famine and the likes were not a new phenomenon in the 1920s. Anyway, going back to Beijing, the Fengtian and Jili cliques did manage to share power for a little while. However, the Japanese decided to start aligning with the Manchurian leaders after the defeat of the Anhui clique, while the Western powers supported the Jili clique. In the city, Jin Yongpen, an old member of the Anhui clique, was made premier to maintain a balance of power. But in 1921, Zhang Zhuoling requested that he resign. Zhang then appointed his own premier, and to reinforce his position, marched an army towards the capital. But this started the First Jili-Fengtian War. Wu Peifu once again outflanked and outmaneuvered his enemies, and claimed victory for the Jili clique. And he became even more influential than the actual head of the clique, Cao Kun. So now the Jili clique was in power in Beijing and had the backing of Western powers. But the south was still in open rebellion, and Zhang and his Fengtian clique all but declared independence in Manchuria. So the Jili clique appointed former premier Li Yuanhong as leader once again, hoping his reputation would unite the country. But Cao Kun hoped to secure power for himself and undermine Wu Peifu, who had become too powerful. So Cao openly bribed members of parliament with 5,000 silver dollars each to appoint him the new president of the republic, which they did in 1924. Hence he got the title the bribing president, which I mentioned before. But going right the way back to 1920, we need to look at what was happening in the south and the various cliques that had sprung up there. The most important was the KMT, which had been set up by Sun Yat-Sen. He had largely hoped to unite China, yet sometimes he was more aligned with the Soviets, other times with Western powers. At the heart of his fight, though, was anti-imperialism and opposition to the warlords. But most of his army had antiquated weapons, or none at all, so he didn't really have the means to launch his northern expedition. He had been leading the first constitutional protection movement since 1917, but in 1920 a challenge to his control emerged. Sun had aligned with the Yunnan clique, the old Guangxi clique, and the warlords of Hunan. But he soon fell out with Lu Rongting, the leader of the old Guangxi clique. As a former military man, Lu was able to seize power in the south following the Xinhai revolution. However, he began to grow more worried about Sun's grab for power, like taking away troops from Lu's allies and giving them to his own, specifically Zhen Zhongming. This resulted in the Guangdong-Guangxi War in 1920. Sun was successful in driving the Guangxi clique out of his province and even invaded Guangxi itself, forcing Lu to leave. KMT control there was limited though, as Lu's soldiers and bandits controlled the countryside, and there was a further rift in the party in 1922. But first I should mention the other provinces in the south. In Yunnan, Kai-Yi died in 1916 and Tang Ji-Yao took over, largely keeping himself aligned to the KMT. While in Hunan, Tan Yan Kai ruled until 1920, when the northern cliques tried to reclaim parts of the south, and one of his subordinates rebelled. This was Zhao Hengtai, and he took control over Hunan and remained loyal to the Jili clique until his eventual demise in 1926. Otherwise, Guizhou was first ruled over by Liu Xiangxi, until in 1920 his nephew launched a coup and seized power, but in turn, he was assassinated and Yuan Ming took over. So Liu Shangxi, the first ruler, led an invasion force into Guangzhou with the assistance of Tang Jiyao, the leader of the Yunnan clique. Tang and previous rulers of Yunnan had actually tried to invade and rule over Guangzhou before, but they couldn't maintain their rule for very long. Then shortly afterwards, Yuan, with the support of the government in Beijing, invaded the province once again and ruled until the mid-1920s. During his rule, he actually looked to expand as well into Sichuan, which for a long time had been in a chaotic state. Famine, banditry, and numerous competing warlords made it one of the poorest regions in the country. Zheng Qiwu took over the province at the beginning, but Sichuan, being in the centre of the country, was soon attacked and invaded numerous times. The first attempt actually came from Tibet in the 1910s, then Kai-Shek and his Yunnan clique invaded, and so on. So Sichuan saw over 470 military clashes during this period. Zheng Qiwu was able to reassert his control, but then he divided up the province into 5 districts, each with their own warlord, who would occasionally fight with one another. So at best, we can put this region down as chaotic, and it would largely remain divided between 5 different warlords. Then, finally, the communist forces did appear in the south in the early 1920s. This party, with its roots in the May the 4th movement, was created by Zhang Duxiu and Li Daozhao. Many of the first party members actually had ties with anarchists in Europe, and their ideas of creating an almost utopian agricultural society developed into Maoism. But early on, Chen in particular believed China should follow the Soviet model with a focus on workers, not the farmers. Plus, the Soviets also pressured the communists into aligning with the KMT, even though they only had 200 members or so. In exchange for accepting the alliance, the Soviets signed the Sun-Joff Manifesto, which brought Soviet aid and advisors into the KMT army. Plus, future leader Chiang Kai-Shek was sent to train in the Soviet Union. The Soviets also agreed to recognize a different model for the future government of China. After all, Sun had developed his 3 principles for the people, which, to grossly oversimplify, were nationalism, democracy, and socialism. But not everybody within the KMT agreed with Sun's policies, and this brings me back to the rift of 1922. Chen Zhongming didn't agree that China should be united with force, and didn't support centralization with almost a one-party system. Chen himself actually preferred federalism and believed it could have been possible to peacefully unite in 1922, as Li Yuanhong was president again in the north. So rather than march on Hunan as Sun instructed, he made a deal with the Beijing government and rebelled. This rebellion ended in failure though, as Sun Yat-Sen got support from the Yunnan clique, and together they forced Chen out of the region. But in the chaos, Lu Rongting, the leader of the old Guangxi clique, re-entered his province in 1923. His rule was immediately challenged though by one of his former subordinates, Li Zhongren. He had created a large army of bandits, joined the KMT that year, and launched an assault on Lu to take power. This was successful, and Li Zhongren and his new Guangxi clique remained in power for years. Afterwards, Sun advocated for Pan-Asianism in order to counter European influence in his country. He then toured the country and got quite a bit of support from warlords, like Ma Fuxiang in the west, who promised to follow Sun if he united China. Now, on the Ma clique, for those of you who have played Hoi 4, you will know the name Shibei San Ma. This literally translates to the 3 Ma's of the northwest, and this name comes from the fact that there were 3 dominant families who divided the regions between themselves. Ma Anliang's sons ruled over Gansu, Ma Fuxiang, who was keen to align with the KMT, ruled over Ningxia and Suiyuan, and the 3rd and final family ruled over Xinhai. This final family included the likes of Ma Bufang and Ma Zhongying, who would also align with the KMT later on. So Sun had supporters in the north and the south, while he was also getting support from the USSR. In the north, the Western powers backed the Zhili clique, and the Japanese backed the Fengtian. But in 1924, the situation in the north changed drastically, as a disagreement arose over the control of Shanghai, as warlords of neighbouring provinces both claimed control over it. Past agreements were broken, and this spiralled in to involve other warlords, and eventually Zhang Zhuolin used it as a pretext to invade the Zhili clique. He had massively increased the size of his armies, but still, against Wu Peifu, they couldn't make any great breakthroughs. But in Beijing, Feng Yuxiang, the Christian warlord, launched a coup, placed Cao Kun under house arrest, and waited for the arrival of the Fengtian forces to enter the capital. Feng and his Guoming Jun agreed to split Jili territories, and he received the poorer western provinces. Plus, during this period, the Emperor Puyi was finally removed from the Forbidden City, and he was forced to live in the Japanese concession in Tianjin. Otherwise, it was during this war that the Fengtian dog-meat general, Zhang Zhongchang, rose to prominence. He took over Shandong, Shanghai, and even Nanjing, thanks in part to thousands of Russian emigres he employed, and their armoured cars. In fact, at some of his feasts, he even dressed like a Tsar, but despite the grandeur, he remained loyal to the Fengtian clique. So the Fengtian won, but the Jili clique was not fully defeated. Wu Peifu retreated to his power base around Hebei and Henan, and his protege, Sun Chuanfang, took over Fujian. Sun began to build a huge army of around 200,000 men, and even push back the dog-meat general, taking over Nanjing in late 1925, and then moved up to the borders of Shanghai. Otherwise, in Beijing, the Fengtian clique surprisingly made Duan Qirui the new president. He was seen as competent, but given that he had few soldiers, was seen as a neutral choice. Then he was tasked with trying to bring the KMT in the south into a unified government. However, Duan could really do very little to renegotiate the unequal treaties with foreign powers, so he would never get KMT support. And then, in the south in 1925, Sun Yat-Sen died. This, of course, created a power vacuum, and many claimed to be his successor. Tang Jiyao first claimed leadership, but this was rejected, so he moved south, starting the Yunnan-Guangxi War. His armies, however, were halted and driven back by Li Zhongren. Tang would remain in power in Yunnan for a couple more years, until he was ousted in a coup by Long Yun. And although Tang was defeated, 4 contenders still sought leadership of the KMT. One was Liao Zhongkai, who, in 1925, was assassinated when he stepped out of his limousine. The party leadership suspected that this was the work of another contender, Hu Hanmin, the former vice generalissimo. He was subsequently arrested, and this left only 2 contenders, Wang Jingwei and the previously unknown Chiang Kai-Shek. They represented different visions of a future China, with Wang more left-wing and Chiang on the right. Wang Jingwei and the leftists had the upper hand early on. For instance, in the international settlement of Shanghai, the communists had been drumming up support in the universities, while on the street many were protesting against foreign ownership of factories and some of the new laws, like prohibiting children under 12 from working in factories, which would have stripped many families of their income. So it further added to the anti-foreign sentiment of the city. As many began to attack Japanese factory owners, one protester was shot. This led to further protests, and these protesters were shot at by Sikh soldiers within the British Army. This in turn began the May 30th movement across the country, and further strikes and protests, notably in Guangzhou and Hong Kong. So in the midst of all this, trade unions and communism began to grow. Also, the Soviets sent men to aid Wang, and the entire navy was placed under the control of Andrei Bubnov. He in turn put a communist named Li Jilong in control of the Zhongshan warship. When Li began sailing without orders in 1926, Chiang believed that a communist coup was underway. So while Wang was ill with a fever, martial law was declared, communists including Zhao Enlai were arrested, and this, the Canton coup, put Chiang Kai-Shek in control of the KMT. Plus, in the north, the strikes in Shanghai caused a major split between Feng Yuxiang, the Christian warlord, and the Fengtian clique. Feng actually believed in the cause of the protesters and wished to remove foreign influence, whereas Zhang Zhou-lin sent in troops to crush them. Then Feng and his Guoming Jun gained an unlikely ally, as a Manchurian warlord named Guo Songling defected to his side. He felt he was being unappreciated, so mutinied and marched on Zhang's headquarters in Shenyang in late 1925. Feng joined in this anti-Fengtian war, but this was a disaster. The Jili clique, including Wu Peifu, stood by the Manchurians, and together they crushed the Christian warlord by early 1926. Feng retreated further west, losing all power in Beijing, But the continuous wars in the north presented Chiang Kai-Shek with an opportunity. He ousted some of the more hardline right-wing members from his party in order to appease the Soviet Union, and they sent Mikhail Borodin to help advise him on a course of action. Then, fortunately for Chiang, his power base in the south increased, as after years of failing to strike into Sichuan, Yuan Zuming joined in the KMT army. Together they would first attack Wu Peifu and his allies in Hunan, as most of his forces were in the north, along the border of the Guominjun. The lack of troops in the south allowed Chiang to quickly take Changsha in the summer of 1926. Although inside the city, Tang Shengzi defected and joined in the northern expedition. Wu, though, was still suspicious of allowing Manchurian troops into his territory, so he was on his own, and the KMT took over Xianin. Wu's counterattacks were then driven back, and the KMT surrounded the city of Wuhan. Now Wu had essentially been defeated, the KMT could focus on Sun Changfeng. They quickly launched an assault into his territory and captured Nanchang that same month. The governor of Zhejiang then defected to the KMT, but this didn't help much, as he was quickly defeated and executed, while KMT advances elsewhere had been pushed back. So another front was opened up to break the deadlock. The KMT, along with many of their Hakka allies, invaded from the south into Fujian, while in November they tried to retake Nanchang. So Sun finally called on help from the Fengtian clique, and the National Pacification Army was created. Zhang Zhouling was the head of this new force, and the Dogmeat General was one of his commanders. This, however, was hugely unpopular, as many saw these warlords as invaders, so thousands defected to the KMT, allowing them to move to take all of Zhejiang by February and finally Nanjing, which they took largely peacefully and were welcomed by thousands of defectors. Meanwhile, that March, the communists led by Zhou Enlai and Chen Duxiu planned a series of uprisings to oust the warlords from Shanghai. This was successful, but the capture of Nanjing and Shanghai caused problems that would last for decades. First, in Nanjing, the KMT began to attack foreigners and consulates. The foreign powers sent ships to disperse the crowds and restore order, but this caused a huge rift in the KMT, as Chiang blamed the communists for the attacks on the foreigners. In fact, there would be other attacks on foreigners across the country, like in Wuhan, where they attacked the Japanese. So Chiang was becoming even more suspicious of the communists, who had actually taken full control of Shanghai. There, his old enemy Wang Jingwei arrived from overseas to meet the communist leadership to discuss the future of an alliance. From there, Wang then moved over to his new base in Wuhan. Chiang, however, met with the leader of the Green Gang to discuss forcing the communists out of the city, and that April he denounced Wang Jingwei and his fellow leaders in Wuhan. Possibly thousands of communists in the city were killed, and some were even publicly beheaded. Chiang then set up a base in Nanjing, meaning that there were two KMT governments, Wang's in Wuhan and Chiang's in Nanjing, both of which continued to advance north slowly. Wang, however, didn't have many supporters, and then Joseph Stalin sent a message to Wuhan demanding a series of measures be taken, including mobilizing farmers, making communist leaders in the new order, and creating a revolutionary military court to punish reactionaries. Yuan and even some of his Soviet advisors believed that this went too far, and he risked losing all support from the KMT, especially as the aid the Soviets provided was far lower than he needed. So Wang turned to Feng, the Christian warlord, for support. He was a supporter of the KMT's ambitions already, and he was already exploiting the situation and was becoming stronger, as in 1927 he moved into Luoyang in Henan, so he now actually shared a border with the KMT. He met with both KMT leaders in June and agreed to form an alliance with Chiang Kai-Shek and purge the communists as well, so Wang Jingwei was left severely weakened. Meanwhile, Wu Peifu had fled to Sichuan and retired, while the Japanese sent troops to Shandong to protect their colony in Qingdao, but they were also providing support to the Fengtian clique. This prevented Chiang from advancing much further north. And then in July, Tang Shengzi, a general in the Wuhan government, launched an assault on Chiang's Nanjing forces. As Chiang Kai-Shek pulled troops south, the Fengtian clique were able to retake Suzhou. This loss of territory forced the two KMT governments to meet to discuss terms. To make peace, Chiang Kai-Shek agreed to step down from his post in August, while Wang agreed to purge communists within his own party. This did very little to unite the party initially though, and Sung Chang-fang launched a huge counterattack on Shanghai, hoping to exploit the divisions in the KMT. Fortunately for the KMT though, leaders like Li Zhongreng called on unity at this moment, and they drove back Sun's forces. Then the two governments were united, but Wang refused to have any part of it. Plus Tang Cheng-si sort of became an independent warlord himself for a short while, before threats of military action forced him into exile in Japan. But even though the KMT was united again, the communists were now independent of their rule, growing in numbers and starting rebellions. Like in August, their small force rebelled in Nanchang, but they were quickly routed. Nearby, Mao Zedong had been busy working on a report on the peasant movement in Hunan, and in September launched his own rebellion. This, the Autumn Harvest Uprising, was also pretty small and was crushed quite quickly. So they needed to find a new base. The Soviets encouraged them to set it up in Guangzhou, which meant they had to march there. This, the little long march though, was a disaster, and their forces were depleted on the way. Many in fact knew this would be the case, and realised they had more support in the interior of the country among the many peasants. Nevertheless, they still arrived there in November and set up the Haliufeng Soviet, which hid in the mountains. The Soviets though still had big plans, and caught wind of an upcoming coup in the region. This was launched by Zheng Fukai as he favoured Wang Jingwei's control over Chiang Kai-Shek, and he hoped to remove the new Guangxi clique from power. So the communists, although unprepared, were pressured by the Soviets into launching the Guangzhou Uprising in December to take advantage of the chaos. At that time they could field maybe 20,000 men, but only a couple thousand had rifles. So again the rebellion was quickly crushed and thousands were killed. Mao though had already fled into the Jinggang Mountains. There he managed to unite a couple groups of bandits into an army of just over 1,000 men. But he had already been kicked out of the larger communist movement. This is because the leadership disagreed with his unsanctioned military actions and the use of peasants, not workers. So this is where he remained for a while. Otherwise, although the communist rebellions failed, they did shock the KMT, who agreed to end all relations with the Soviet Union. Wang Jingwei, feeling reprisals, fled the country, and this allowed Chiang Kai-shek to break the old agreement and return to power late in the year. But a stalemate had sort of developed in the north. Luckily for the KMT though, they actually grew in numbers, as Yan Qishan of Shaanxi joined them, but still no breakthrough came. They spent the winter regrouping and rebuilding their now 1 million strong army. Then in April, they prepared to advance again. Chiang, Yan and Feng assaulted Sun's forces from all sides, and quickly moved on Jinan, where Japanese troops had been stationed. Chiang Kai-shek promised the Japanese in the city would be safe, but he couldn't stop fighting from taking place. Japanese were killed in May, prompting the Japanese army to launch reprisal attacks, and Chiang Kai-shek was forced to leave the city in embarrassment. After this event, he quickly came to believe that Japan was the greatest threat to China, but he gave lectures on how China could only reclaim the city when they were strong. Japan, on the other hand, had long argued that Shandong fell under their sphere of influence, and this, the Jinan incident, proved they were willing to fight for it. So Chiang Kai-shek avoided the Japanese and progressed north, to finally assault the Fengqiang clique. Zhang Zhuolin began to be pushed further and further back, which worried the Japanese. They threatened that if the KMT were to enter Manchuria, they would get involved in the fighting directly. Zhang, however, was proving to be an untrustworthy ally. He was already losing the war, plus he printed off money to fund the war at such a rapid rate that he completely ruined the economy. With pressure mounting against him, Zhang tried to withdraw from Manchuria, but the Japanese placed a bomb under his train and assassinated him. This was the Huanggu Tun incident. Afterwards, his son, Zhang Zhuiliang, was in control of Manchuria. He was a womanizer and an opium addict, so the Japanese believed he could be controlled more easily. However, as his allies quickly evaporated, he made peace with the KMT, allowing the KMT to seize Beijing and reach the borders of Manchuria. Then, in late 1928, he declared his allegiance to the KMT, finally reuniting China. The dog-meat general refused to surrender though, and even declared war on the new Manchurian leader for joining with the KMT, but he was trapped on both sides and defeated. However, Zhang Zhuiliang then made a new enemy pretty quickly. For decades, the Russians had owned the railways running over to Dalian. There was talk of the Soviets peacefully returning it to the Chinese, but this didn't happen. So, misjudging the situation, the Manchurians stormed the Soviet offices. Stalin responded by arresting all Chinese citizens inside the Soviet Union, cutting off diplomatic relations, and got Japanese diplomatic support for a limited invasion of northern Manchuria. 20% of the Red Army was then sent to the border, and such a response caught the Japanese off guard, and they scrambled to put an army together themselves, which actually included thousands of White Russian emigres. But equipped with machine guns, the Soviets attacked in August 1929. They assaulted the Japanese fleet on the rivers, and then, in November, they made their way to Manzhouli, finding the Chinese unprepared and looting their own goods. So the Soviets were able to restore control over the train lines, but the Chinese citizens that had been imprisoned were released, and they had all had their property confiscated and many had been tortured. The Japanese also tried to challenge the new united government. They funded the dogmeat general as he returned to Shandong in early 1929 to launch a huge rebellion to try and reclaim his territory. He even encouraged his old soldiers to mutiny in Beijing, but this rebellion was crushed and the province was split between Liu Zhenyan and Han Fuju. As for the rest of the country, well, Mongolia and Tibet remained independent, and the Muslim Maqlik had a pretty complicated history over the last few years. The provinces they ruled over had been devastated by famines and the likes. Some leaders, like Ma Fuxiang, had actually aligned with Feng and his Guomingjun, even though they were Christian. But way back in 1925, the Christian warlord invaded Gansu, and his allies were put in control. When Feng joined in the northern expedition, many in the Ma family rebelled against their own family members to try and claim power. One of these rebels was Ma Zhongying, who received some support from the Feng Tian clique. Meanwhile, many Tibetans in the area joined with the Guomingjun and began to fight against the Muslims. So it was chaotic, and it's believed hundreds of thousands died as towns were massacred in this, the Muslim rebellion of Gansu. But as China was united, the Guomingjun still held Gansu while the rebellions were ongoing. Then down in the south in Yunnan, Tangji Yao was ousted in a coup back in 1927. Long Yung took over, and although he would later be somewhat tied to the KMT, he maintained a great deal of autonomy throughout the following decade. Then there's Sichuan, which was still largely divided at this point, but they would soon become embroiled in a war with Tibet. And in the far west in Xinjiang, the longtime governor was assassinated in 1928. This allowed Qin Shi Ren to take power, but his rule would begin the very long Xinjiang Wars, which saw Japanese and Soviet involvement. As for the rest of the country, it was split between the chief warlords, although again within each of these domains was almost a feudal-level hierarchy. The Guomingjun kept the west, the Guangxi clique took a lot of the south, Chiang Kai-Shek and the KMT kept control of Nanjing and parts of the south and east, the Shaanxi clique took over Beijing, and the Feng Tian clique stayed in Manchuria. They did have a problem in Guizhou though. Yuan Zuming had been assassinated, and Zhou Jicheng took over. He actually began to mint coins featuring the car he received from America, possibly the first in the region. However, to drive it, he needed to mobilize the population to build roads. Anyway, he broke from the KMT, so in 1928, Chiang Kai-Shek got support from Long Yun in Yunnan and invaded. Although Zhou died on the battlefield, Mao Guangjing took over the fight and he was successful. To make peace, he made some agreements with Chiang Kai-Shek and the KMT, but they soon found out that he wasn't honouring his word. So Chiang found an ally in Wang Jilai, who took over in 1929. However, once again, KMT power in this region was limited. So now most of the country was united to some degree, but the question remained how to reorganize the country. Chiang Kai-Shek favoured centralization, but this meant stripping the warlords of a lot of their authority. This dispute would lead to a couple civil wars in which hundreds of thousands would die, and very shortly afterwards, Japan would invade Manchuria.